listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, why federal MP Zali Steggall is predicting the Liberal Party will be obliterated if it backs down on net zero. With a decision imminent this week from the embattled opposition leader over its policy stance, Zali says now is the time for Sussan Ley to stand up to the Nationals. All those details in just a moment, but first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Monday, the 10th of November. The United States Senate has voted to end the government shutdown that's dragged on for 40 days, the longest in US history. In a late-night vote on Sunday local time, 60 senators, including 8 Democrats, backed a funding bill that will reopen federal agencies through to January 2026. The shutdown has left hundreds of thousands of federal workers unpaid, disrupted food aid, and also caused widespread travel chaos amid staffing shortages in air traffic control. 2 senior BBC executives have resigned after revelations the broadcaster misled viewers in an episode of its Panorama program that edited a speech by former US President Donald Trump. Director General Tim Davie and BBC News boss Deborah Turness have stepped down after a litany of failures outlined in a 19-page report sent to the BBC board. It accused the BBC of selectively editing President Trump's January 6th speech to appear he had directly urged supporters to march on the US Capitol. The BBC is expected to issue a public apology as questions mount over how the broadcaster will rebuild confidence in its editorial independence and impartiality. And ANZ has recorded a 10% fall in yearly profits to $5.89 billion. The bank's CEO has blamed soaring costs and intense competition in the lending market for the fall in profits. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with the member for Warringah, Zali Steggall. The Independent says now is the time for the federal government and opposition to take action on climate change. She says we're all paying the price with destructive weather, skyrocketing insurance costs and food bills for the lack of action. Zali also shares her thoughts on this weekend's neo-Nazi rally outside New South Wales Parliament and why tougher laws and regulations are not the answer. Zali, thanks so much for joining us. If we can just start with these developments regarding that very disturbing Nazi rally outside New South Wales Parliament over the weekend. There has been a new few developments, including the New South Wales Speaker, Greg Piper. He's saying that he knew ahead of time that these neo-Nazis planned to rally on the steps of Parliament House. And everyone seems to be asking, how did this slip through the cracks?
Absolutely. With the amount of scrutiny we've had on protests and demonstrations and the need for there to be a balance between that right to protest, democratic, free country, but making sure that it is safe and social cohesion. And we've had a lot of debate around these issues in the last couple of years. So I failed to understand how this protest was actually permitted on the basis of who was applying for it. And so knowing that, there's a clear failure within the New South Wales government to implement the very laws that they have passed.
And in regards to continued fallout, some of your colleagues, including Vaucluse MP Kelly Sloan and Wentworth MP Allegra Spender, have both referred threats they received to New South Wales Police after they spoke out against this group of men protesting against the Jewish lobby. This is unacceptable.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we know social media can be a pretty horrible place. I must say I put up a short statement calling this out. The anti-Semitism and racism is just unacceptable and has no place in Australia. And I had some comments on social media that I certainly had to block as well. So it's clear that there's a reset that's needed and we need to use all the tools available. So where laws have been passed against this type of speech, that actually has to be implemented. So I am looking to the New South Wales government to explain how it happened. And I hope the AFP are in a position to properly investigate the threats that were made against Kelly Sloan and Allegra Spender.
Zali, if there is a push by certain authorities or the government to say, look, we need tougher laws and regulations to crack down on these type of groups, what would you say to that? Because from what we can understand, there are current laws and processes that can effectively stop what happened over the weekend.
Yes, I think it's always a really difficult balance because we are still in a liberal democracy. We need to have the right to protest, the right to free speech. But at the same time, we have anti-discrimination law and anti-vilification law. And certainly we can't allow racism and anti-Semitism has no place on our streets. So we already have laws in place. The question is, are they being applied and properly implemented? So that's the question I have for the government and the police. I don't understand how those banners were allowed to remain in the circumstances of what they said.
Let's move on now to another passion of yours, being climate change and the climate crisis. You wrote a great article over the weekend saying, like we have to prepare for war as a country, we need to prepare for a climate crisis. It's not going to happen. It is happening and it's right on our doorstep. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is we accept that we need to invest in our defence capabilities, that it's important as a sovereign nation that we have a certain spend on defence each year to make sure we build up that capacity to meet a threat in the event it was to occur. We don't wait for an army to amass on our doorstep before we start saying we need a defence force. The same applies for climate risk. So climate risk is what I very much view as our domestic security and safety. It is the biggest risk to our community. We know households are very much at risk and it's going to get worse. That's what the National Climate Risk Assessment says. So I'm calling on the government to reposition the conversation around climate risk and how we prepare for it. Here in Australia, it's about embedding safety and security. So calling, for example, that like defence, we have 0.25% of GDP investment in climate adaptation and resilience each year to build that with capacity within our communities. We can't just wait till the next disaster strikes and next community is flooded or bushfire hits to then turn around and say, here's a lot of emergency response funding. I mean, we will always do that. But we have to start investing in the preparation and the resilience.
What would you like to see as part of that multi-billion-dollar package by the federal government? Because concerningly so, there have been elements and I guess the desalination plant, a lot of controversy when we needed it. It was actually almost a white elephant. We couldn't use it during the drought, which happened in New South Wales and Australia, pre-COVID. So what would you like to see to ensure that billions of dollars is put in the right places to ensure that we're climate prepared?
Well, ironically, we already know that there's already a lot of knowledge on the ground. So local governments have plans, but they don't have the funds to implement it. So we know place-based solutions are best and nature-based solutions are best as well. So things like mangrove corridors to be sponges in estuaries. So where we have communities that have built on floodplains or around rivers and estuaries, they are at high risk of flooding. There is a lot of information already out there around what can be done to create safe sponge corridors that absorbs excess water flow, for example. Now, I hosted a round table on climate risk and resilience, and the Australian Local Government Association have put a plan to the government, but it's not funded. And so that's where this 0.25% of GDP can be allocated to local government areas to do those place-based solutions and adaptation pieces, which then flow on to communities, because at the moment, residents pay for the risk through their insurance premiums. They then are at risk of losing everything. And all too often, there were measures that could have been taken that have not been taken because they're not funded.
Zali, I'm glad you make that point, because right now the majority of Australians are dealing with a cost of living crisis. They would validly argue we can't afford to pay our food bills, we can't afford to pay our insurance bills. But when you look at it from a bigger point of view, we are all paying, especially with skyrocketing power bills, for the government's lack of action and decades of neglect in preparing our country for a climate crisis.
Yeah, look, the power bills the issue is we have to transition, and we have an aging coal-fired power fleet that is all pretty much due to retire by 2030, 35. It has to go. So it has to be replaced in the cheapest way possible. So we are playing catch up on that, but progress is being made. But it's really important that we have proper information and not misinformation that is targeted at slowing down the transition. For households, though, climate is actually exacerbating pretty much every cost point that is hard for a household. So food will become more expensive. Obviously, your insurance is incredibly important. Now, for renters, the same as people that own their own home, you spend your whole life accumulating certain assets, whether it's your home or your furniture. And if you are unable to afford a home and contents insurance or insurance on your home, it means that when one of these events strikes, you lose everything, right? And we are talking about buildings that are often not able to bounce back from a disaster. So people have lost their entire life's assets or work in one event overnight. I find that's unacceptable. We have to start having much better plans in place, and the government has to support state governments and local governments to build that resilience in. For example, we don't treat homes and contents insurance as an essential item that we need. The government charges GST on homes and content insurance, whereas it does not charge GST on your health insurance, because the government takes a view health insurance is an essential. We want people to have health insurance so that it alleviates pressure on the public system. I would argue we need to shift our thinking around homes and contents and how we insure assets, because if not, the government will be the insurer of last resort, or communities will just lose everything, which is, incredibly traumatic and very difficult. And so if the government's focused on productivity, this is an essential part of keeping productivity and communities going, is they need to be able to reopen post-disasters. And that just won't happen if there's no insurance.
Zali, let's talk about the coalition and its stance on net zero. We've seen the coalition effectively self-implode over this. Their polling results and latest surveys show their support is dwindling and plummeting as a result of this. We've seen a split with the Nationals and the Liberals over net zero. What are your thoughts on it?
Oh, I think it's nearly time for a conscious uncoupling in the coalition, because I just don't think there is a proper grasp of the policies and the issues that are really important to the vast majority of Australians. I think the Nationals are pursuing a line of policy that is disconnected to reality, and it's disconnected to a resilient modern economy. We have to modernise our energy supply. We have to transition. There's no doubt about that. So the Nationals, I think, are very much holding the coalition to ransom when it comes to their policies. And now you're seeing the Liberals at the federal level, having this debate as well. What it shows, I think, is just how the internal machine of the party is so removed from communities, where on the ground, people have overwhelmingly said they're worried about climate change. We need to address it. Now, yes, there is cost of living. There are other issues, but they're not disconnected issues. They are all intertwined, and you have to have a sensible policy on this. There is no moving away from net zero, because net zero ultimately is a requirement of the Paris Agreement. So if the coalition or the Liberal Party were to change their commitment, that is saying that a coalition government would take Australia out of the Paris Agreement. Now, to me, that says unelectable.
So do you think this is a major setback from the coalition? Do you think we will see Sussan Ley will step up and say, okay, if this is the stance from the Nationals, we are consciously uncoupling?
Well, I would expect that of her if she wants to have credibility when it comes to acting on climate. You can't on one hand say you accept climate risks are important and are a risk to our nation, but on the other, you don't really want to target, or you don't want to have any kind of pressure on how fast you're going to mitigate the problem. That's what the Nationals are saying. They're saying, look, we accept climate change, we just don't want to target. It's like, I was an ex-Olympian. It's like taking a start gate but not having a finish line. It doesn't make any sense. You don't drive investment. You don't have any kind of drive or push from the private sector to help government solve the problem. What we know is there's huge opportunity around the transition. Australia actually can harness a huge amount of renewable energy and be a leader when it comes to technology, but we have to get on with it. We can't waste another 10 years of having this internal debate. So if the Liberal Party can't actually stand strong against the National Party, then it shows how far they have fallen from relevance.
That was Federal MP Zali Steggall. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. Sasha Barbagat speaks with researcher Kaz Ross about how neo-Nazis in Australia are seeking political legitimacy and whether they could gain real electoral support.
I think people misjudge Nazis at their own peril if they think that they're stupid or this is never going to happen or they're overreaching. They have some very smart people in their leadership and they have people who are very politically savvy. So they're gaming on pushing this anti-immigration line and toning down the Nazi stuff.
We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.